So this is my second conversation with Timour Azhari. He's a Beirut-based Lebanese journalist with Al Jazeera. I wanted to talk to Timour because few people are able to explain what's happening in Lebanon with such clarity. The first episode that we had was in April, and it's entitled Lebanon's October Uprising 6 months later. You can check that out if you want some background to what we're talking about. But this episode hopefully can also serve as a standalone one. We spoke about the economic crisis rocking Lebanon, as well as its political implications. We spoke about its origins and what can be done about it, the government's lack of response so far and how they're actually making things worse. And we spoke about how protesters have been reacting to the situation and what we might expect next. I've had some technical difficulties while recording this, but hopefully it shouldn't be too much of a problem. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter @FireTheseTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information, you can visit the website. Thank you.
I'm Timour Azhari. I'm a Beirut-based journalist and online correspondent for Al Jazeera. So in our pre-chat right now, we were talking about how difficult it is to even answer the question, how are you? So let's actually start the chat in this way. So how are you, Timour?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you just a similar version of the answer that I just gave you. It almost feels like the question, how are you, needs to come with a trigger warning today in Lebanon, because really, even if you're in the best of conditions, you can't escape the feeling that's around you. Maybe if you try extremely hard, you can. But if you're just going through a normal day, you're at some point going to sort of get back to the crisis. You can be eating ice cream and remark how delicious the ice cream is, but end up talking about the lira. All roads and all conversations lead to the lira today, and the economic situation in the country. So doing fine, relative to others, very well. There are so many people, going hungry, scared about rent, scared about their jobs, scared about their savings. Luckily, I'm not in a position like that. So relatively good.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is surreal. It is absolutely surreal. I had you on, what was it, like 2 months ago or something? And we were talking about the October uprising revolution 6 months later.
Yeah.
And I mean, but the changes in the past couple of months on their own have been utterly insane. I'm now in a position where I'm now in a situation like so many others where I'm not in Lebanon. People know this by now, but obviously most of my friends and family are back home, and it's just from it almost felt like within a day, essentially. It's not within a day, but it felt that way, that people have started talking about rations, like they have to actually ration food. They have to think of which food they can put in the fridge in case electricity actually cuts off.
Yeah.
Obviously, salaries are, especially if you're paid in Lebanese lira, which is most people obviously in Lebanon, those are really going down the drain. I have a close friend who literally quit her job because the toll on her was so high and the salary became so low in comparison to the work that she was actually making, because it was paid in Lebanese liras. It's just, it's quite surreal. I don't even know if this is even possible to answer, but if you were asked to give some kind of overview of what the hell is going on in the past couple of months, and I don't know, start whenever you want, how would you explain the situation?
I'd sort of explain it if we're starting at the time of the protests, October protests, till now. Yeah. It's particularly the sort of overarching feeling was hope. Now I'd say the overarching feeling is a mix of anguish, anger, and depression. And so that's pretty much the change that has happened in 9 months. I mean, it's honestly been a roller coaster. Although a roller coaster usually goes up and down and up, but it's pretty much been down since around October, November. So obviously the last time I was on, we talked about 6 months and basically how things had turned from protest to sort of economic crisis, basically taking over the narrative, filtering down to, you know, everything, including protest slogans, which before were very sort of like idealistic and sort of had this inherent striving towards this better society that people want to have, but now have really gone towards simple needs. So like one of the popular ones is بدنا ناكل بدنا نعيش, which means, you know, we want to eat, we want to live, which is prominent now on the streets. And so that's sort of where, you know, where we were 6 months afterwards. I'd say that in the past 2 months, really, we've turned from sort of this moment where people were sort of holding their breath, feeling like there was something imminent, that crisis was around them. There was really a feeling of crisis. And in the past 2 months, sort of the floor has given out underneath everybody. And you know, just, you know, 2 months ago, the lira was, you know, the exchange rate of the Lebanese pound to the dollar was about 2,800, 2,900. Today, it's around 9,000. And so that sort of stratospheric change that we've had just has really, you know, evaporated entire life savings. People who sort of felt secure in being middle class or upper middle class are now poor. People who are poor have been just completely decimated, are just sort of, you know, hand to mouth, as they say. You know, you work so that you can put food on the table that day. If you don't have any work that day, there's no food on the table. And increasingly, we have a society that's dependent on aid. And, you know, people who, whether it's government, you know, very meager government provisions, or, you know, NGOs or goodwill, you know, charities. So that's sort of the situation now. There's a lot of parallels being made to Venezuela, and the sort of hyperinflation that happened there, the sort of lack of goods on shelves. We started seeing that here. I was at the supermarket just today, and it really was sort of surreal. I mean, you walk through the supermarket. First of all, there are signs on you know, reminding you as you walk around not to take large quantities of things. So most supermarkets are now instituting some form of rationing, whether it be, you know, not taking you can only take 2 of a certain item. My friend, my roommate here, who's a journalist at Megaphone, John Dagher, a very good independent news organization, he actually went to the supermarket and wanted to buy Oreos, you know, which is something sort of benign in a way, and they declined to give him you know, more than 2 packs of Oreos, which is you know, almost sort of a comical look at it, but it just sort of gives you an idea of where we are today. And obviously, when you think of or you know, this sort of romanticized image of Beirut and Lebanon, and even what it was a couple of years ago, despite all the corruption, despite the economy lagging, you never saw shelves sort of emptying out in this way. You know, you never had this sort of fear. And while I was at the supermarket, of course, there's the reminder of, you know, that this crisis is so layered in its you know, sort of malignant layers. You know, while I was there, the electricity goes off, and you know, the entire supermarket goes dark. People are sort of standing around, and that's because we have massive power cuts because there's a fuel shortage today. And so the crisis is extremely layered. Every day you feel like you're sort of being pounded by what's happening around you. And increasingly, I feel like people don't really see a way out. The only way forward for most people is to get out. And that's why we have talk of this massive sort of emigration wave that is starting now. Close friends are leaving, and it's sort of I mean, I think that's sort of a sign of where we are today. You know, in Lebanon's sort of 100-year history, we've had waves of emigration. You know, so after you know, a famine in the early 1900s, 1915 to 1918, then we had people leave in sort of the late 50s when there were sort of civil troubles. Obviously, during the Civil War between 75 and 90. And then after that, you know, sort of kept seeping away, but I feel like now we're in front of a new wave of emigration. And so we can add this economic crisis to sort of the history of calamities that have sort of roiled this country in its short 100-year existence, which it's actually celebrating this year, sort of ironically.
Yeah, I mean, they had like a concert yesterday or something on the celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Grand Liban, Greater Lebanon, which itself followed the Great Famine, as you mentioned it, which itself also was followed by waves of immigration. Now, of course, I mean, the Great Famine was quite extreme, and we're not talking, I mean, hopefully we're not talking about the same kinds of proportions, but it is quite surreal, honestly. I mean, it just feels like yesterday we were all freaking out about the lira going up to 2,000 compared to 1,500, and now it's at 9,000, as you said. And how how can you explain it for people who don't have an advanced knowledge of finances or economics? Why has it gotten to 9,000, for example?
Okay, well, basically, Lebanon's economy wasn't really an economy as far as economies go. The country didn't really actually produce anything for years, and that's just sort of because of a prioritizing of which sectors are supposed to sort of have the majority in the country. So basically, Lebanon's economy was real estate and banking. And those sort of depended on large amounts of money coming in from abroad and being invested here. What happened is that money started drying up. But the background to all of this is that for years, you know, and I say that I you know, sort of put the background in the foreground here because I think it's important when talking about Lebanon's crisis to basically say that for at least 30 years, but longer if you count the civil war years, the country has just been sort of eviscerated by corruption. Private, public, it doesn't matter. Any sector, any state institution is either, you know, pulled under the reins of one party or politician or split between different politicians. And basically politicians sort of suck, you know, the state treasure out of these institutions or through these sectors via monopoly or via straight up corruption. And so for years, Lebanon was sort of eviscerated, its state coffers eviscerated by corruption. Very little money was spent on, you know, productive things like making a better infrastructure, you know, subsidizing sectors such as tech or whatever it may be, sort of, you know, sectors of the future. And so we kind of enter this period over the last 10 years of a really economic slowdown. Tourism dies down because Lebanon's relations with Gulf countries sort of fall apart, basically due to the rise of Hezbollah and the growing prominence of Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's important to note that, you know, some people will say the whole economic crisis is Hezbollah. No, but they do have certainly an influence, especially on the tourism sector. And the Syrian war also plays a part there. From 2011 onwards, sort of the whole region, you know, sort of in the direct aftermath of the Arab Spring, entered a period of sort of reactionary politics and regressing economies in a way, especially Lebanon. And so from 2011 till now, Lebanon's economy has sort of been stagnating, 1% growth, 0% growth, and basically, you know, the whole Lebanese system of supporting the Lebanese pound at 1,500 pounds, which has been in place since 1997 for 23 years. That support at 1,500 pounds allowed people to purchase things, you know, allowed people to have a greater purchasing power than actually anybody else in the Middle East. But it was that was sort of artificially high, or at least in the Levant region. What happened is that the money stopped flowing. And so Lebanon's economy, which was extremely reliant on the foreign inflows, suddenly just had a dollar shortage. And so when there's not enough dollars to go around, it basically means that, you know, Lebanon's currency starts depreciating. We don't have a real economy. We don't have anything to back it up. So it's a lot about the dollar reserves that we actually have at the central bank and at private banks themselves. And so I'm no economist, but basically there's an acute dollar shortage today where inflows have really sort of, you know, confidence has been shaken in the system, basically in the banking system. And so dollar inflows have basically fallen apart. And now sort of the rest of the economy is collapsing, sort of on, it's collapsing, but has sort of been slowly falling apart for years with high unemployment and no real economy. And so today Lebanese are sort of faced with a situation where, you know, from even if you're a small wage earner to a millionaire, in a way, the party is over in terms of this sort of spending in a way that really wasn't backed up by anything. It was sort of backed up by this strange rentier economy. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. And so now sort of the question is, how do you move forward? And you need basically a cash injection just to keep you know, basic goods in flowing, like wheat, fuel, medicine, and other things. It's important to note that wheat, fuel, and medicine are very important, but basic goods should also be considered meats. Or if you're a vegan, you might have a different point of view here. But generally on the Arab table, meat and other goods that aren't typically considered basic goods are really important. And so now the question is, how do you support the Lebanese economy? And you need a direct cash injection. And that takes us to where we are now with sort of IMF negotiations and the Lebanese government at least saying on paper that it wants to get $10 billion from the IMF and a further $10 billion from a bunch of international donors. And that's basically to jumpstart the economy. It's sort of to defibrillate the economy and to sort of have enough money to fund the state, pay teachers, pay doctors, etc.
Yeah, it's basically emergency mode. We're not even at a stage where we're even saying that let's say the $10 billion are going to just be injected and everything is going to be solved. We're literally just talking about preventing further catastrophe, essentially.
100%.
And you mentioned one thing about the IMF, so let's get into it a bit, but it will touch upon the question I was going to ask anyway, which is like the parallel political development, obviously, which is a big part of the story here. We started talking, last time you were on, we spoke, of course, as we said, about the 6 months update. And by then we were sort of analyzing what the Hassan Diab government was doing, pros and cons, and so on and so forth. And yet now we find ourselves, like, I'm already hearing talks about, like, they are considering bringing Hariri back, which is quite surreal. They're considering so many different things. And it's almost like I had Ronnie Chatah on a couple of days ago, and he was talking about the October 16th. Like, it's almost like they're October 17th is when the uprising started. So it's almost like they're trying to reach back to just the day before the uprising started, as if that is going to be the next goal, which is quite extraordinary if you consider the consequences from from a day-to-day perspective. So
right.
Like, how would you for those who don't know as well, like, can you give kind of an overview of the past few months? You can start in October as well. I guess it's inevitable. And how has the political development paralleled the economic crisis, and obviously the link between the two?
Yeah, the economic crisis started before the protests and was a main driver of the protests. That's important to get straight from the beginning, because many sides like to sort of say that everything fell apart as soon as protesters took to the streets. That's just baseless. And so what we saw basically is economic situation getting worse, rising talk of austerity, and then when Saad Hariri's government tried to begin implementing austerity, people said, well, hell no, we're not going to take this, and that was sort of the October 17th protests in a very simplified manner. 13 days later, Hariri's government is toppled. He resigns, despite the fact that Hezbollah, the Amal movement and the Free Patriotic movement didn't really want him to resign. They wanted him to stay on and keep the government alive. He resigns. And so we go through a period of vacuum. And then in February, the government of Hassan Diab is born and gains confidence on February 11th. Named by basically establishment parties, Hezbollah, its main ally, the Amal movement, and the Free Patriotic movement, as well as the Marada movement, a smaller Christian party. So named by establishment parties, but Hassan Diab says we are an independent government of technocrats or specialists. We are here, not to sort of make friends or engage in politics as politics. We are here to save the country. We have a clear mission to save the country. The first sort of month, I would say, went more or less positively for the government in terms of the rhetoric was on point. I've said this several times, but just the optics of Hassan Diab as someone who speaks Arabic and can give rousing speeches when compared to Saad Hariri, who does not speak good Arabic and does not give rousing speeches, at least sort of served a purpose in a way of, it instilled some confidence in the government. And generally, you have a few ministers in there who seem to know their files quite well, and I would say have independent tendencies. But basically what became clear very quickly is that, and this is what main protesters were saying, and it was the main argument against giving them a chance, which many had asked to do. The main argument against giving them the chance was that, hey, they've been named by the same politicians, therefore they answer to the same politicians, and therefore the result won't be any different. That more and more shown to be true. And so from, I'd say, even the second or third month, it started to become clear that this government isn't actually the one who makes the decisions. It's the politicians, the 4 or 5 people in the back rooms who make the decisions, and they can decide which legislation lives or dies or sees the light or doesn't. And so I think we began to see that quite quickly, and now increasingly the government is, I would describe it as sort of rudderless, just like a ship which is unable to sort of chart any direction. It's still floating, but it doesn't really seem to be heading anywhere in particular. And in the past sort of weeks, it increasingly looked like it may sink. And I find it a bit funny to use this boat metaphor, because Hassan Diab gave a speech in which he used a 2.5-minute boat metaphor, which a lot of people pointed out was a bit sort of over the top, but basically how he was the captain taking over a ship that had empty fuel tanks and, et cetera, et cetera. So if you stick with that metaphor, the ship is looking in a bad state right now. And so, yeah, so what we've heard basically is talk. And in the past months, it's been clear that many people who are in the government and supposedly backing it do not actually back it and would love to have somebody else in place, a political government, be that Nabih Berri or Sulaiman Frangieh, the head of the Amal movement and the Marada movement specifically. So while they have ministers in government, important ministers like the finance minister, they have been sort of in these backroom dealings, which increasingly look and now have been sort of confirmed by some political operatives. There have been sort of talks between political factions about sort of a path forward. It's not really clear what kind of government would come next. Hariri is saying that he has certain conditions, that he would not, for example, be part of a national unity government, which was basically a government of all political forces, governments of sort of 30 ministers, which you can just imagine trying to get anything done, where no one really agrees on any principles. Not that many of these parties actually have strong principles that they stick to. It's mostly interest-based politics. So that's sort of where we are today. We went through a toppling of Hariri, Hassan Diab, maybe a brief period where it seemed possible, but now sort of stasis, this rudderless government, which is increasingly needing to pander to sort of political parties, be it Hezbollah or other sides, to stay in power. And there have been increasing calls to resign from people in the, including people who supposedly back the government, basically saying that we need an alternative government. What kind of government that will be, again, we don't know. There's a lot of speculation about sort of the game that politicians are playing now. But I would say at this point we can see Hassan Diab's government as really completely politically exposed, if you will, like up to the will of politicians, the sort of ruling politicians, the 5-6 in this country.
And like along those same lines, we've also seen in the past couple of months or so as well, in that same time frame, it's sort of like, I'm not going to say a return of the banks because they never really went away, but we've definitely seen a rhetoric in which some high-ranking banking officials it's almost like they've gone more confident or more arrogant as the worse things got. And at the same time, we've seen like, I don't know how you would describe them, I'm sure you can describe them better than I would, but like negotiators on behalf of the Lebanese government who were sort of, representing the government with in the IMF negotiations. How would you explain that situation? And obviously the fact that some of them have even resigned because, in their own words, they have been arguing, they argued that the Lebanese government is actually not interested in significant or meaningful reforms.
Right. So the biggest achievement of this government was building or making this plan, this rescue plan, financial rescue plan, which they said, the president said this, the prime minister said, really was historic because for the first time, it really gave a clear picture of the disastrous situation that the Lebanese financial system is in, including government, central bank, and banks. And so this plan basically said that there were somewhere around 60 billion in losses, and that's basically accumulated losses between the central bank and private banks and the government. Just 60 billion that's not there. And so basically that plan received a lot of praise from the international community. Then, we formally announced we were going to negotiate with the IMF. The IMF said that their numbers broadly looked like the government's numbers. And this plan from the outset was shot at by the Association of Banks in Lebanon, which is the banking lobby, and the central bank, and establishment parties who are known to be, establishment figures who are known to be in line with the banks, like Saad Hariri, major shareholder in a bank, and other politicians. It's important to know in Lebanon that business interests and politics are extremely closely linked together. And so many politicians and decision makers in government or in parliament have stakes in banks. And so for a while, it seemed that things in Lebanon, with a lot of help, and I have to say this here, with a lot of help from the nerds and other sort of economists, traditional economists, but also the rise of the nerds, which was basically a group of Lebanese abroad who basically throughout the uprising sort of turned their gaze back on Lebanon and gave their expertise just on Twitter, on social media for free, basically breaking down these sort of very sort of, Byzantine kind of, long sort of financial reports into digestible, sections that people could actually understand. And so for a while, it seemed, we might actually be going towards a just distribution of losses, because that's what it's about. The losses are there. The 60 billion losses are there. But how do we distribute them between banks, the central bank, depositors, the government? That's the big question. And so for a while, it seemed like, well, the emphasis is going to be on the banks and the central bank, being restructured and carrying a greater share of the losses. And we try to impact the state and depositors as little as possible. Increasingly, it's turned the opposite now. So banks and the central bank have always argued the state should sell its assets, that basically, their big argument is that the state should sell its assets. But what experts will say and analysts will say is that also means de facto that the average person is paying. Why? Because what is the state's assets? The state's assets are, the water companies, the telecoms companies, lands. And in a state, the people own that in the end, right? Because this is public property. And so in a way, what you're doing here is you're transferring losses from banks onto the people. And that is increasingly the argument that has taken hold now. And in the past couple of weeks, we have seen two members of the negotiating team with the IMF resign, both of them saying that the government had basically made the decision, or the political establishment rather, had made a decision to go against what was in the interest of the people. And so basically, we've seen a parliamentary committee, the Finance and Budget Committee, sort of rehash the numbers, come up with losses that are much lower, using what have been described as accounting tricks, and basically sort of derailing IMF negotiations and creating disunity. The government does have a little bit of blame to bear here because they didn't consult the banks and the central bank enough. And that is an important point to state. They really didn't do their duties there. But the IMF, international accountants, experts, the international community are all saying, we think that the numbers, the scale of the losses are much bigger than what this parliamentary committee is saying they are. And so basically what we've seen is the IMF negotiations have been sort of stalled. The finance minister said last week that they're sort of semi-officially on hold. And basically the IMF have told the Lebanese side, you guys have to get your numbers in order, you have to come to us agreed, and you have to start reforms. And taking basic measures. And so like one of those measures, it's important to note, is capital controls. Since November in Lebanon, because of the banking crisis, people have not been able to take their money out of the banks. There is capital controls on their money in the banks. That has been done informally and illegally. There is no law allowing banks to do that. And so since the beginning, people were saying, well, let's make it official, as many other countries do when a crisis hits, when an economic crisis hits, including Greece or Argentina. But there was opposition to this from some sides, most prominently Nabih Berri and the Amal movement. And so one of the earliest signs that this government was not independent and technocratic, despite sort of being called independent and technocratic, was when a capital controls law was pulled from the cabinet agenda by Nabih Berri, because basically he was saying that, you know, this is going to affect depositors or etc. We don't know what exactly his reasons are, but any sort of economic analyst worth 2 cents, worth their weight, will tell you that we need a capital controls law. It's one of the main demands of the IMF. But here we are, almost 9 months later, with no capital controls law. Massive amounts of money have left Lebanon in that time. You know, we're talking about estimates ranging around 20 to 25 billion last year alone, in a country with a dollar shortage, I remind you. And most of that money has left from big accounts, from people with connections. People who, it's important to say, probably run in the same circles as the establishment, as Nabih Berri, as these people. And so you can sort of see the interests there. So here we are 9 months later without even basic legislation that would usually be used to address an economic crisis. And consequently, the IMF is saying, hey, what the hell, guys, get your act in order. And so the negotiations have sort of fallen apart. There's disunity on the Lebanese side. There has been very little show of political will to enact reforms. And that's why increasingly it's feeling like, hey, I mean, what's the solution here? This government seems, unable to do anything. But at the same time, this political establishment is the reason we are here. And so to expect anything of the political establishment is sort of a fool's errand. And this government is basically not its own decision making. يعني مش صاحب القرار, as you would say in Arabic. They don't sort of own their decision. And that's where we are today, is sort of in this crazy situation where, respected civil servants are now resigning, including Alan Bifani, who headed the finance ministry as a director general for 20 years. And he said he was resigning because of these dark forces that are basically working to destroy the plan. And he basically said it, word for word, that it's a political, financial sort of arrangement that is working to do that. And so, yes, it's the return of the establishment. It's the establishment fights back. And today it looks like on that, it seems that they are actually sort of winning. And there's a lot of depression about that.
I'm going to actually just read some of the headlines from your Al Jazeera profile of the stuff that you've covered. Basically, and this is just mainly only June, actually. So, 3rd of June, a morphine shot. Lebanon exchange shops reopen after crackdown. Then on the 4th of June, Lebanon MP, Jamil Said, protesters outside officials' homes should be shot. 2 days later, 6th of June, tear gas, stone throwing as Beirut demonstrations turned violent. 3 days later, June 9th, Lebanon eyes tourism with the international airport reopening by July. Yeah. 2 days later, Lebanon's cabinet fails independence test. 1 day later, protests rock Lebanon as currency collapses. 20th of June, so about a week later, it's sabotage. Some fear Lebanon's IMF bailout talks in peril, and so on and so forth. So we have some where you kind of show that, well, the government is hoping that tourism can actually come back, which sounds quite incredible to be honest. And then the last one, which is the long one that you published a few days ago, plotting our escape, Lebanon braces for new immigration wave. So I don't even know how to ask this question, because it's like all of them at the same time. You did mention these waves of immigration that are pretty much already happening, and they're definitely going to happen in the coming months and probably in the coming years. As I mentioned in the pre-chat, I have friends who are planning their way out. They don't know when it can actually happen, but they really see no other way, because they have to think about how to make enough money to send back home, usually for their parents or grandparents. And at the same time, we've seen different protests, some in Trablus in the north. I think there were some in the south, definitely a bunch of them in Beirut. And we've also seen, parallel to the, let's say, Lebanese protests, quote unquote, you also have protests there was a number of Sudanese workers who went on strike, I think, and they protested. There were Ethiopian workers who protested recently there because of what's happening in Ethiopia. There's also some link to that, but there's also the fact that in Lebanon, we've seen Ethiopian women essentially being dumped on the street, like quite literally dumped in front of the Ethiopian consulate by Lebanese sponsors who don't want to deal with them essentially anymore. Can we talk a bit about the kind of like the multi-layers of all of this happening sort of like at the same time? The Sudanese one, the Ethiopian one, the protests in Tripoli, which were a bit different than the ones in Beirut. In that, what I mean by that is that they were actually much angrier at some point in the past month, and then there was the a murder of a protester whose name unfortunately I forgot, and so on and so forth. Can you talk a bit more about kind of like the street side of these events in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's many things to address there. I'd say let's start with the first one of things going a bit more angry, and then I'll move to sort of the layers, and the involvement of people who aren't Lebanese in Lebanon. Definitely things turned more angry as people just saw that it was going nowhere, and I'd say that a lot of that anger it sort of exploded at one moment. With several weeks of sort of rising, I'd say low-level violence, rioting, people using Molotov cocktails, destroying banks, even in some small cases lobbing them towards security forces, and then just sort of a big crackdown by the army and by internal security forces on protesters that led to Fawaz al-Samman being killed in Tripoli. And sort of all the anger that surrounded that. He was a young guy with a child that had just been born. He ran a motorcycle shop, just sort of was struggling to, just make ends meet, and was shot by the army and died. And so that created a lot of anger, but it's sort of it signals, I think, a turn, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, to the point where sort of the bottom drops out. While there were sort of these nice protests with nice ideas and sort of striving, a lot of striving towards goals in them in the beginning, sort of lofty goals in a way, ending sectarian state or judicial reform or whatever it may be. It just really becoming almost just an act of defiance against the conditions that people are being forced to live in. And so another part of that bottom dropping out has just been the way that foreign workers in Lebanon have been treated for many years. But now basically the rot has shown, and I think that's what this crisis has done in a lot of ways. Lebanon was in a way rotten through and through. But I don't know if you've ever sort of been on a walk in a forest or something, and you pick up a stick and it looks perfectly normal from the outside, but if you pick it up, it sort of falls apart because termites have just completely eaten it from the inside. And that's sort of the similar situation to what Lebanon is now. For years and years, it's just been completely eviscerated by corruption, and along with corruption, sort of came, to a certain extent, with corruption and sort of the weakening of the state and sort of the falling apart of many people's dreams came sort of. I would call it sort of a moral sort of people's values and people's morals and the way people deal with each other did slip, and I think that that's something that would naturally sort of accompany a situation like you have in Lebanon. And so the way people treat foreign workers, for example, and the fact that the kafala system, which I love that you've covered so much on this podcast, like having on people like Banshir Yimmer, who's one of the people who's really fighting against this and is a victim herself of the system. So this system, the fact that it's been able to go on for so long, and really, in all intents and purposes, it is modern day slavery. An employer hires a worker, but she can't end the contract, nor can she amend the contract unless the employer agrees. I mean, how does that sound to you? And hundreds of thousands of people were employed in this way. And so basically, and this is an issue I've reported on in the past, just the abuse that the domestic workers are subject to. And now it's reached a point where, people are just dumping off domestic workers really like trash in front of their embassy, especially Ethiopian domestic workers, of which I think they make up one of the largest cohorts, single cohort of domestic workers in Lebanon. Yeah, they're being dropped off at the embassy, have been for weeks, just dozens and dozens of women. The lucky ones, some lucky ones have been able to get on repatriation flights home, as have women from the Philippines, from Ghana, people from Bangladesh, I think soon will be. So basically it's sort of like jumping ship. It's really that it's sort of a sign that things are going down, that all of this rot is really coming to the surface, and people who before employed a domestic worker and sort of would get away with not paying them for a month and then paying them for a month and sort of relying on this morally bankrupt system that we had here, now can no longer even afford the month or two, and sort of things are falling apart. I would say a tiny silver lining here to mention a small positive is that we have seen I feel this issue of domestic workers and foreign workers in Lebanon and their conditions really come to the fore and gain a lot of coverage. And that's been accompanied, I think, by sort of, it's sort of like the chicken and the egg, but these people have been, I feel, much more empowered. I think that they're listened to, and in a way, amidst this chaos that the Lebanese state is enveloped in, they, to a certain extent, have managed to carve out a small space for themselves in terms of, basically what I'm trying to say is that more people are aware of the situation, and I feel like it's in a way harder to get away today with treating people this way. Even though Ethiopian domestic workers are being dumped at embassies, the amount of awareness about this, and both in the international community and NGOs, the amount of pressure that's being put on the labor ministry to end the kafala system, I think really sort of has increased a lot, and that's a lot thanks to the work of these women. The domestic workers themselves, people, activists like Banshee, and NGOs that have really pushed this cause and are really trying to end the kafala system. And I think that it's one of the things that Lebanon, sort of in the situation it is now, is thinking of doing, kafala reform, because it looks good to the international community, and just because it's just so indefensible. That it's really it's really hard to maintain. So that's one of the positives. And yes, we've seen Sudanese workers protesting as well. The case of Sudanese refugees in Lebanon is a long-standing issue that hasn't been resolved for years. I would just say again that we've had all of these issues for many years, especially the kafala issue, with hundreds of thousands of people living this way. But Lebanon's crisis has revealed the level to which just this rot has permeated all forms of life in the country. And whether it's increased electricity cuts today and fuel shortages and sort of all the crises have come together, both on Lebanese and for guests in this country, and that's the state we're in now, sort of heading downwards with really no bottom.
And the despair that we mentioned before, and here I'll mention a trigger warning in advance because we will mention suicide here. There's been a number of them. I think there's been 3 in the past, just in the past few days. One of them was very visible. The other one I think was in the south, if I'm not mistaken, and I forgot what the third one was. But they, the one that was in Hamra, was accompanied by a note in which he basically said, like, "Ana mish kafir. I'm not a kafir, blasphemer, unbeliever, whatever." But basically, it's a reference to the fact that, like, hunger is what should be blasphemous. And it's very difficult to talk about this. So try and explain it as much as you can, of course. But we are talking, and this is not the first one. In some months ago, there was a Syrian man in the Bekaa, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. This has happened a number of times. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it does seem to have. It has happened a number of times. It does seem to be the case that it's fair to expect that a number of them are going to this is going to continue to happen. I also see parallel to this or this might just be an impression on social media, but there is a heightened awareness as well on this particular issue and people sort of coming together. I don't even know how you can explain something like this, but can you just talk a bit to those who don't even know about like what has been happening on that front as well?
Yeah, it's sort of the ultimate expression of just reaching a dead end that we've seen in the past few days, with 3 people killing themselves. One of them, sort of clearly because of the situation in the country. The other 2, sort of have been written up to that. One of them was an 82-year-old man in the southern city of Sur. But this particular man in Hamra, I mean, just extremely tragic, and sort of hitting at the heartstrings, sort of core sort of malaise of the Lebanese state since, before, the times of the civil war to now. That lyric which you put, Ana Mish Kafir, it's a famous lyric from a Ziad Rahbani song, which was written, I believe, in 1985 during the Civil War.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that, but sort of it's still in the Civil War, and it's basically a song talking about how, I'm not a heretic or a sinner or a blasphemer, but hunger is a sin, or is blasphemous. And he sort of goes through it, and basically the point of the song is to say that people are as individuals are not sinners, but the conditions and those that have created the conditions are. And so it's extremely powerful and poignant, obviously extremely tragic. And usually when something like this happens, we do in the next day or two see other people in a way, I mean, I don't know if inspired is the right word, but sort of copycat in a way.
Yeah, the copycat suicide is the term for it, yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, we have seen that. And people were very quick to say, I believe one of his relatives in the street was saying that day that, this isn't a suicide, he was killed in cold blood. And when you look at sort of the track record of suicides in the country, at least even in the past since December of last year, for example, as Karim Shayib, Lebanese journalist, pointed out on Twitter, you have at least sort of 5 cases. A man in Arsal who hung himself after not being able to give his child 1,000 lira to go to school with for a packed lunch. So I mean, it's devastating. It's there's really few other ways to say it than it's devastating, and people really, I feel, move between extreme sort of sadness, a feeling of helplessness, and anger. And you can't help but feel angry, and you can't help but feel sad and sort of paralyzed by what's happening. There are, I think it's always important to say that there are still things worth fighting for, and there are still people fighting. And so we see, for example, I've heard whispers of basically a lot of political groups, both those that came out of the October protests and those that were around before, but were sort of supercharged by it. Those organizations coming together, sort of coalescing, they're really talking about a joint platform, and basically creating a political movement early on before we have parliamentary elections in 2022. At least that's when we're scheduled. You never know in Lebanon if the elections are ever happening. We went 9 years without them, from 2009 to 2018. But so that, I mean, increasingly talking to people, and it's also sort of my belief in sort of reading the things, that it'll be very hard to affect sort of top level political change just because of the way these sectarian leaders are entrenched, and really unbudging and extremely cunning, and they've been playing this game for more than 30 years, and they're the masters of this game. And so I think that elections is really one of the sort of few things that Lebanon has, and it's important to say that political organizing isn't just elections. It's also making independent unions. It's municipal election level. It's community organizing, which we are seeing more of. And the uprising still, its legacy lives on in terms of the fact that it brought people together. It showed just the extent to which Lebanon had human resources, both locally and around the world, on which it really can rely to sort of found a new state. But it's a matter of how to get there. With crisis, there is always opportunity, because in a way in Lebanon, it's really clear that the old system is sort of dead or dying, or is sort of a zombie system. And while analysts will be quick to say that, hey, don't these people can always turn things around and always come back in power. I think that's true, but I think the pillars of the system are sort of dead, and that presents an opportunity for political alternatives to come to the fore. And there is a lot of organizing happening. It's very important, I think, that for these parties to really push their message, and a lot of them are now, because people are just so sort of depressed, and basically, again, the immigration sort of issue comes to the fore, because people are basically in the zone of, hey, I mean, we're just going to get out, because, I mean, what can I do, in this country? How can I move forward here? No, the point is just to get out. I think Mashru Leila said it quite well, and it's a quote I put in my piece, that البلد قاعة انتظار والطابور وصل على المطار, which is, the country is a waiting room and the queue has reached the airport. And that's really how Lebanon feels today. Just anyone trying to leave any way they can. But you have parties and sort of independent groups who are really saying, hey guys, come on, let's try to keep morale up. Let's try to push for a political alternative, and lead up to parliamentary elections and try to get a few independent MPs in parliament. And so basically it's a long road forward, and Lebanon very well could be in front of a lost decade in terms of its economy if the crisis isn't treated properly. If it is treated properly, you're still probably going to have like many years of hardship, just people's lives, just pretty much a pauperization of the country, where the people are just impoverished, and you have extreme wealth inequality, between those who have and those who don't, basically. But I think that's sort of the path that things are taking: organizing in syndicates, organizing politically in the lead up to municipal and parliamentary elections of 2022. And that's sort of one of the things you can try to hold on to. I'd say that's where we are today. On the counter side, you have a massive crackdown from authorities on free speech, on criticism. You've had at least 30 people who have been called in for interrogation or detained just in sort of the past 3 weeks or so. And so you're really seeing almost every day a new sign of crackdown. So it's a really difficult situation. It really more than ever feels sort of unstable, and it feels like at any point sort of any kind of attack could happen, and it really wouldn't be surprising anymore. And so it really is an incredibly difficult situation here, but there are things worth fighting for. And just sort of an anecdote is, this weekend I drove to the Bisri Valley, which is a valley where, the authorities want to build this huge dam project, the crown jewel in their dam project of the energy ministry. And it's just extremely beautiful. You walk down, you don't pay a thing. You walk down Roman stairs towards a river. Just incredibly lush landscape, beautiful country that really reinvigorates this feeling in you that there really are things worth fighting for. It's hard to maintain that during the week, so maybe go to Bisri Valley every weekend or somewhere similar.
Oh yeah, and I mean I also went through Bisri just before traveling. So you mentioned two things. I mean, you mentioned one thing that's very important, is that okay, we have the election in 2022. Assuming they do happen, as you mentioned, that we have had quite a bad record in recent years of them being postponed, and it's not it's not inconceivable that they may try to do that again. But we'll leave that for another time.
Yeah.
In the more like short-term future, there is the fact you just mentioned them. So if you can talk about this a bit about this increased repression, which so far has taken the form of, we've seen lots of beatings, we've seen people just being asked what's the word, like they're asked to go to the interrogation,
yeah,
and so on, and maybe like other things that may not necessarily pop up in the headlines. So I for example, there is what was it, the president of the Farmers Association saying that if nothing happens, like by tomorrow they will go down on Beirut or something like this. Like these are things that for me personally, although like I would count myself as being fairly well read when it comes to Lebanon and like following stuff and whatnot, especially since around the You Stink movement of 2015, these are like actors in the Lebanese scene that we don't often see as much.
Yeah, I mean, so basically what freedom of expression activists will tell you is that since Michel Aoun came and became president, there's just been a much more heightened crackdown on free speech in the country than really any time since really the Syrian presence in Lebanon, in terms of people being called in to interrogation, and just this weight on people, an insult here, a joke there, a video here, an article, really just sort of the things that made Beirut a hub in the past, just sort of a literary hub, a city of letters, a city where people would flee to from around the world, from as far as Pakistan or different parts of the world, or even Japan, to sort of be able to talk, and write what they wanted. I'm just reading Kim Ghattas's book Black Wave, where she sort of details this. And so fast forward to today, and Beirut is increasingly becoming a place of repression, be it sort of the inherently regressive forces of the economic crisis and sort of the way that destroys culture. But also, just the actual crackdown by the army, by general security, by the internal security forces. And so, yes, I mean, every day we have a new iteration of this, whether it's, someone who posts a video in which he criticizes the president, sort of almost hilariously. This activist, Michel Chamaoun, posted a video in which he was criticizing a decision by a judge to pursue people who criticize the president. Judge had issued a decision where he's basically saying we will prosecute people who criticize the president. This guy criticizes the president, and then he's called in. That was almost sort of in a way, I'd say the beginning point of the latest wave of crackdown, which really almost every day, I mean, it's really hard to keep up. A few days ago, this director, Ahmad Leiza, who, just makes, sort of videos in sort of the style of Megaphone, very sort of snappy, quick graphics. He was called in for a video about that, and I believe one of the charges was taking away from the prestige of the Lebanese passport. Humor is dead. At least in general security, so it's extremely troubling. I mean, all people really have now is their critique of the policies, and that's in a way what October 17th uprising was on a massive scale and through different means, feet on the street. But criticism and critiquing, policy and politicians is exactly what Lebanon needs at this point. And so to crack down on that is a really bad sign, because basically what it's saying, as Jad Shahrur, who is a spokesperson for this Samir Qasir Foundation, told me, basically what you're saying here is we know that you're going to criticize us for what we've done, because what we've done is really bad, but we're not going to change what we've done. We're just going to, imprison you. And so that's it seems that's where the situation is now, where even mild criticism, is sort of warrants an arrest warrant or an interrogation. And what we've also seen is basically specifically this issue of collaborating with Israel has really been thrown around sort of extremely. I mean, what in Lebanon is an extremely sort of almost the worst thing. I mean, sort of even above treason is collaborating with Israel. And it's been thrown around. Several people have been accused of this, including a sheikh who was, I believe, the former mufti of Tir, southern Lebanon. Not exactly a place known for, collaboration with Israel in terms. I mean, it was a hub of resistance against Israel during the occupation here, and so. I mean, that is extremely worrying, because we know from the case of Ziad Eitani in the past, this theater director who was imprisoned for over 100 days on charges that were just completely fabricated. Obviously, no one held accountable. And so this is being thrown around. And I would say that in addition to criticism of the president and the government, criticism of Hezbollah is becoming, much more sort of, there's a lot more pushback against criticism of Hezbollah today. And that's obviously extremely worrying as well, because Hezbollah is an armed force in Lebanon, and obviously, I mean, extremely worrying. So yeah, that's the situation we're in. The question of free actors sort of taking part in or having a part of the debate that weren't there before. I would agree that especially this sort of the Farmers Association, or going back to domestic workers and domestic workers and former domestic workers, foreigners in Lebanon, taking sort of the microphone into their own hand and talking about the abuses that they've suffered here is in a way a silver lining, if you can call it that. I mean, it's obviously horrible, but that what happened to them, but just the fact that that they are being given a voice, I think is important and a positive development. It's an extremely sort of mixed picture in that sense, and really every day feels like it could bear a new scandal or a new crackdown. And actually just a few days ago, I was supposed to head to a press conference, and the main reason I wanted to go, it was actually the resignation of this man Alan Bifani at the finance ministry.
Yeah.
The main reason I wanted to go is because he had said that he was going to expose politicians, and I really believed that we're in a climate now in Lebanon where people could come to the press conference and just beat him up and walk away, and there would be no accountability.
Yeah.
And just a few days later, Wasif Harake, who is a prominent activist, he was basically a lawyer for many protesters. He was a parliamentary candidate on an independent list in 2018. Wasif Harake walks out of a radio interview and gets assaulted by 4 men who, drive up to him on mopeds. They beat him up. He's bloodied, and till now, nobody has been arrested. Investigations are ongoing, according to the Interior Minister. But we'll have to wait and see whether anything comes of that. Most often in Lebanon, nothing comes of it. Mm-hmm. And that is the climate we're in. I really feel that we are in a climate today where crackdowns on freedom of expression and beating people and sending clear messages to people like Wasif Harake that we could do much worse to you, but we only decided to beat you up today. These are clear messages being sent, and it's extremely worrying. And I hope that these words aren't sort of seen as too prescient in the future, but I fear that they will be. In terms of, it's clear. I'm no Einstein. It's just clear from the trend that's happening that this is sort of where we're going, and extremely troubling.
No, we are. I mean, it does feel. I agree. It does feel like this as well, and. I can share this now. I mean, I've already went public with this, but one of the reasons why I wanted to come back now, but like other than COVID-19 related worries, obviously, I wanted to visit Lebanon, but like I'm postponing it for now, just because among other things, a number of lawyers that I know have told me like just lay low for now, like don't actually come back. There's a number they can use anything against any activist, writer, journalist, or whatever, anyone in between. And I mean, for me personally, it's I don't think they have anything on me, but like who honestly, who the fuck knows? And it's just one of those things that the risks are just so high, and that in the context of Lebanon, it wouldn't take much for you to be in the Ziad Itani situation. Essentially, it just doesn't take that much, and there's no real guarantee essentially of like legal processes or whatnot that would at least soften the blow, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's just, there's always, been talk of the fact that Lebanon is sort of a weak state, but again, it's just become so clear now, from the minor issue of traffic lights being off when you drive through major intersections now, apparently because of an issue with a maintenance contract. But an issue with a maintenance contract warrants turning off traffic lights, apparently. In any state that respects itself, that would not be allowed to happen. But from an issue that's really the sort of baseline like that, to this issue of the crackdown and the fact that really political interference has completely riddles the judiciary. Judges are appointed by politicians, their raises are done by politicians, their positions are guaranteed by politicians, and so they answer to politicians. Obviously there are some good judges, but that is the Lebanese system. And the same can be said of security forces, appointed, given raises, whatever it may be, by politicians. And in this corrupt system that we have in Lebanon, these people serve the interests of politicians. And so there's really no reason to believe today that a file can be made up, a case can be written up against any activist or prominent person in the country. And here there is a really important role, I feel, for the international community and donors who too often seem too complacent with these issues, to really, really catch this early. Obviously, what you can do is limited as a foreign state, and I'm not calling for foreign interference in Lebanon, but I believe that if there's any sort of interference, quote unquote, that is worth, sort of, interfering in a state's business, it would be to protect freedom of speech, because I think that's just a universal sort of quality that we can all agree is important, and it's extremely worrying. As a journalist, but as a person who, I mean, just is from this country and, I mean, just has friends who are activists and normal people, and it can affect anybody, and it has affected most people. I would say know someone or have heard of someone, maybe most people in these circles who has been detained or has had a file written up against them,
has been assaulted, yeah.
Sorry, has been assaulted, yeah, and so it's a small country, and so yeah. the message that the crackdown intends to serve doesn't take a long time to spread.
No.
And that message is spreading. But here it's important to basically say that people are extremely brave for continuing this criticism. For a lot of people, it feels like it's all they can do. I mean, you have a country that is increasingly unemployed, increasingly sees no future, and so will gladly protest or critique or really feel like that's all that they can do. And so to erode that is just, I mean, it's you're basically in a sense, trying to block a force that is not going to stop anytime soon, and it's going to be a source of a lot of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of I giggled a bit, but like not too loudly when you mentioned foreign interference, just because I know that like activists and journalists and writers and commentators like have to be super careful about not even like suggesting anything remotely like that, while at the same time politicians like it wasn't that long ago where there was like regular weekly meetings with Riyadh. They would fly to Saudi Arabia, obviously Hezbollah with the Iranian connection.
Yeah. It's sort of hilarious that you get accused of being pro foreign intervention of America and Lebanese affairs or whatever, but all these politicians are outwardly, completely openly subservient to overlords in the Gulf or Iran or wherever it is. And again, freedom of expression, I mean, in the same way that, the UN would criticize China for cracking down on free speech in Hong Kong, I think what's happening in Lebanon should be roundly condemned by the international community, and there should be action taken through whatever channels to ensure that that this does not go unpunished or is allowed to just happen. I mean, it's completely unacceptable.
And I mean, this is like the inevitable part, honestly. Whenever we talk about these things, if we wanna be like thorough in our analysis or in just trying to explain what's happening, but the international dimension here, like whether we want to or not, is quite relevant. And other than so, there's like a number of ways we can approach this, and we may not get into it all of it, but the stuff with the U.S. ambassador last week, the connection between that and the Caesar Act and the U.S., which for those who don't know, Caesar is the name of a defector from the Syrian regime, who, when he defected, took like thousands and thousands of photos, evidence of torture and murder in the Syrian regime's gulags. And so, I mean, this is the background, but then the Caesar Act is a U.S. Government act. And among many things that it proposes, most of which is like related to America, but in the Lebanese context, there's a specific, obviously, or might be potential consequences, which if you can like expand on a bit. And the other thing is, I don't even know how we can do this, so like feel free to answer however you want. But like, how can we explain to those who may have like an okay background, but not maybe an advanced background, of how much like geopolitics in Lebanon matters so much, the relationship between Lebanon and Syria, that's like one minefield in itself, but like more like let's say foreign policy oriented stuff like with Iran or with the Gulf. How are these things playing out right now, if at all? Is it like, I feel I've been seeing the Gulf sort of like kind of taking a back seat in the past year or so, but not fully. By Gulf here, I mostly mean Saudi Arabia. So how would you explain the recent developments, if you can also give some context in this? And I'll see, based on your answer, what I can add to the conversation, because it's such a massive thing. I don't even know if we can get into it that much.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we approach the bigger and then we go to the Caesar Act. But basically in Lebanon, from its foundation, it was sort of a pull between different sides of the world, be it in the beginning like the French or the Arab side, and then in more recent times, basically Syria and Iran axis, or the Gulf and the West axis. And there's a constant push and pull between those two things. I would say that it's been clear for a long time that the Iran axis is the one that's has made the most gains. Via Hezbollah and just its power in the country, and just basically there are red lines that you can't cross, and when you try to cross, you could get a mini civil war or some form of civil unrest, low level conflict. And so that has effects, and so Lebanon, I mean, whether you love the Gulf or you don't, or you love Saudis or you don't, Lebanon, to a large extent, its tourism, it's the money that came to it, into this unproductive economy, which, I mean, that's a completely different story. The economy was rigged in a way that it shouldn't have been. In the way that it worked, tourism and the vital sort of tourism dollars that came from the Gulf were extremely important, but the Gulf has increasingly turned its back on Lebanon, just because they saw, to speak in the broadest terms, that their interests weren't being sort of met by the people in Lebanon, who are the ones who are supposed to meet their interests, right? The Saad Hariri and sort of the Lebanese forces, and that pro-West sort of axis, the pro-West, pro-Gulf axis. So that has had economic effects on Lebanon, and people increasingly talked of the defense minister even recently said that there is a siege on Lebanon, because of the way its political orientation. I think that's a little bit sort of trumped up. Even the Caesar Act itself, so far, it hasn't really shown to have direct consequences in terms of direct sanctions on Lebanese people, or sanctions that really directly target Lebanon. What it probably will do is it won't allow Lebanon to participate in the reconstruction of Syria, which had been something that politicians were keen to push, although the viability of that was actually quite questionable. To what extent Lebanon would actually benefit for a host of reasons, but that was a gamble that a lot of politicians made, or a story that they like to tell. With the Caesar Act, it's harder for that story to seem true, because anyone supporting the Syrian regime, and it's specifically construction, according to the the words of the legislation, basically would be subject to sanctions, or could be subject to sanctions. Basically, I mean, it's not good for Lebanon, but it's the full effects aren't really clear yet. Geopolitics definitely continues to to play a large role here. There are those who increasingly call, like, muwatinun and muwatinat fi dawla, which is citizen in a state. It's one of the sort of parties to be to gain most sort of attention during the uprising and in the aftermath. It's led by Sharb al-Nahas, former labor minister who resigned in protest during his tenure. And basically what they argue, and what many argue, is that basically Lebanon is not treated as a state by its politicians. It's basically treated as a sort of staging ground for the the interests of various sides, and so they basically call for dealing with all sides as external parties. I think that's something that clearly has to be done. You can't keep sort of running after Saudi interest or Iranian interest. And I don't want to go too much in the weeds, because I mean I mean you have to get to sort of a numbers and sort of concrete conversation. But basically, yes, geopolitics still plays a huge role. But also just the corruption and failure of Lebanon's political class, I'd say more than anything, is what's preventing us from moving forward, at least in an economic sense. It's the fact that politicians have again and again shown and that they are not willing to reform, because reform would hurt their interests. And so from Lebanon has basically been sustained by money pouring in from this geopolitical scheme, from these various axes to fight it out here. That money has increasingly sort of dried up as sort of it became clear which side was winning. At least that's my analysis. And at the same time, Lebanon would get money from international donors at Paris 1, Paris 2, Paris 3, each time saying, yeah, we'll do reforms, give us the money, we'll do the reforms right after. And then they never did the reforms. And so then you had Sadr in 2018, April 2018. 2015, where the international community pledged $11 billion, in terms of grants and very soft loans. And 2 years later, none of the reforms really that are demanded have been done, and the main one is electricity reform. And so it's just that's sort of the main reason I think we are where we are now, rather than this international conspiracy or a siege on Lebanon. I think a large part of the blame falls at the very same at the feet of the very same politicians who like to spout these sort of convenient myths of a conspiracy. And so if tomorrow they do electricity sector reform, judicial reform, they make a clear public procurement process, so you're not doing random tenders through some ministry that's completely intransparent, I think that you could start to see a climate in which aid could be dispersed, because people are willing to help. Europe doesn't want another failed state, especially this close to it, especially with 1.5 million refugees in it. It's really not in the interest of the international community to have that. It's not out of the kindness of their hearts for the Lebanese people. Mm-hmm. Although there is some quite a substantial amount of humanitarian aid. But yeah, so I would just say that the main blame for where we are today falls at the feet of these politicians, and geopolitics plays a large role, but I wouldn't put the crisis down to any kind of conspiracy.
Yeah, no, of course I agree with that. And I think that's a good summary, and like the specific relationship between Lebanon and Syria, I did go into it in some episodes, but I will dedicate something like special, something separate on that at some point in the near future. And we don't even have time, honestly, to get into the very weird recent development of Hezbollah basically saying that China is going to save everyone. And I don't know, there's just so many different angles to this. Most of it probably won't actually lead anywhere, as these things often come and go. But I'm very curious if we as on a sort of closing note, I don't even know first of all, thanks a lot for your time. This is not easy to summarize everything, and you've done so quite well. What would you say is realistic to expect in the coming weeks and months? And especially if I mentioned that Ronnie Shadha before, a previous guest mentioned the way he described it is okay, we're going back to an October 16th scenario, as in the best the government is aiming at is just the day before the revolution started. Right. And today I'll plug in their podcast, the Lebanese Politics podcast, that the episode they released yesterday also said something along those lines. It does seem to be if they really are I'm not going to say if they're crazy enough or stupid enough, because whenever we've asked that question, the answer has been yes. Bring back Hariri or any of those situations, that we will definitely be seeing again those protests bubbling up. And even if they don't do this, I do think it's fair to expect that protests are not going anywhere at this point. It's the worse things get, the more desperate people get. There's no reason why they would stop protesting.
Yeah, there is no reason to see people stop protesting. In fact, every day you have marches and people sort of gathering, even just on a neighborhood basis outside the electricity company, in their villages. That's not going to stop, I don't think, anytime soon. It's really hard to look forward, but you can imagine a scenario where Hassan Diab's government sort of continues to stay in power for a while. Maybe passing some, so-called reforms, but really according to the pie sharing that we've become used to in Lebanon, as we saw with top financial appointments about a month ago. And that's when I wrote that piece on how Lebanon's cabinet failed its independence test, because people were just appointed based on which political leader liked them or not. And that's
unlike following a sort of technocratic model, which at least a significant percentage of protesters were asking for at some point.
Exactly right, and that would be a clear sign of doing things differently. But they failed that. And so this week, in fact, tomorrow we're supposed to see appointments to the electricity company. Done in backroom dealing. Nobody knows why these people are there, except that they are, a certain sectarian leader likes them. I think that we might continue to see this process moving forward. I don't expect IMF negotiations to work well. I really don't see that, at least with the way things are going now. There are many scenarios that sort of people have drawn out. Michael Young on Twitter, who works for Carnegie. He was basically, set out several scenarios that you guys can like check on his Twitter. But basically without an IMF program, it's hard to see Lebanon moving forward, and that's for two reasons. One, we need the cash injection, but two, many of the reforms that the IMF wants, or the measures that it wants, are actually in the interest of the average Lebanese person. Electricity reform, judicial reform.
Sure. Yeah.
These are things that really, if they happened, Lebanese people would be happy, the international community would be happy. The only people who wouldn't be happy are the ruling politicians who benefit off of the current state of things. It's really hard to see them pushing that through, and so that puts IMF negotiations in very difficult straits. But at the same time, maybe if they see that they can sort of work it out in the way that serves them, basically, as we discussed earlier, by liquidating state assets instead of making banks bear their share of the burden. Maybe they will actually go through with it. It's really hard to tell, but now Hassan Diab's government, I would say, looks extremely rudderless. Can do some minor reforms, window dressing, but it's not. I wouldn't bet on expecting any major reforms. And eventually, I don't think that this is a government that would last until elections in 2 years. I think eventually this government will fall. There's just too much talk of it falling today, and I think that political parties have an interest in sort of coming back to power. Saad Hariri wants to be prime minister again, and that's all he sort of has going for him, right? And I think that at some point he will come back, or someone he supports will come back, and I wouldn't say we'll be back to before October 16th, because I think that there is a lot of this change in terms of just the collective consciousness and the way people look at things. Even the quality of some shows on TV, the kind of debate you have on the country has been enriched. So there's no going back, but are things better, and will things be better than they were on October 16th? No and no. And I don't see what people, if you remember, went to the streets on October 16th for attacks that would, I think, have amounted to $6 a month on WhatsApp, and just look at how much people have paid since, in terms of their savings being lost, their purchasing power destroyed, and just in terms of even mental trauma. And sort of the difficulty that people have gone through. So it's clearly gotten much worse, and it's a very sad note to end on. But I don't see it getting better in the future, and it's almost an easy answer, because all indicators point that way.
Before, I wanted to kind of conclude on my side as well, but I remembered while we were talking that there is something we didn't fully explain, is that we were talking about how we need this injection of cash. But for those who don't know, why can't this injection of cash just come from the massive diaspora that we have, for example?
It technically could, but why would it? Which guy who's worked in Saudi Arabia for 30 years is going to be like, hey, let me send $1 million so that it can be used in the Lebanese banking system? It just doesn't make any sense. Nobody would do that. And so the diaspora could play a role if you show reform, you rebuild confidence, you give them a reason to want to care about this country. But I don't see that happening in the future. And it's a good point, because during the protests, the diaspora had a really active role. We saw solidarity protests around the world. You even had the diaspora coming back, flying in just for a weekend so that they could be part of what was happening here. Really incredible. I think I said something in my piece along the lines of, it was almost cruel, because the uprising had refocused the gaze of these people who had fled Lebanon on the country at a time when the economic ruin had already been set in motion. It was almost like the uprising in a way was like a going away party, for the country. And many people actually came there and they were just getting to know it. It's quite sad, but I don't think there's any reason for the diaspora to take a leading role in that.
That's true. What I wanted to say is that one of the things that we are like we can say sort of a hopeful note, and it is a hopeful note, like it is, I'm not just trying to dig something just because everything else is so depressing, but the hopeful note is that we've said this together, even like when we were guests on the Arab Tyrant Manual, we've said this as well, and I think it's just as true now, is that there's a certain way of doing things that they were doing it in a certain way before October that is simply not working anymore. And this does mean, like, this does open the potential for, as you said, like the 2022 election, that might be like a sort of a stepping stone in a sense. We'll see by then what happens. The organizing of independent unions, that's definitely something that's definitely very important to look forward to. And I would like encourage everyone to definitely engage on that front, because it's extremely important that we do so. There is, I'll plug them again because they mentioned on the Lebanese Politics podcast, they have an episode with Leah Bukhata, I believe, in which she talks about the importance of unions in Lebanon and how they were co-opted in the 90s and early 2000s, if not destroyed. And that is a very, very important part of very recent Lebanon. We're talking about the past 20 years. Like, this is something that is part of our history, it's part of our legacy, it's part of stuff, like tools at our disposal without romanticizing it, just like tools at our disposal that actually could, like, we could do something with. And on the other front, of course, you have those that already have this, let's call it sectarian mentality, if not sectarian interests, that are just doubling down and becoming like nastier and more obvious in their sectarianism on television.
Yes.
That, they are part of the equation that we can't ignore. That we're not. No one is really saying that October just fixed everyone and changed everyone's way of doing things. There's definitely a lot of sectarian resentment, sectarian xenophobia, hatred, and everything that it's still there. And our worries, and we saw it for a few nights of like sectarian clashes, especially between like supporters of the Hariri gang and supporters of the Hezbollah and Amal gang, like kind of fighting it out. We saw it for like a couple of nights. Thankfully, it didn't escalate more than that. That's always there in the background. Like that's also always something that I'm worried about as well. But what we can control is the things that we're already, like the stuff that we were talking about now, the unions and so on and so forth. And I do think that in the same way as like kind of like this parallel story that we're talking about, like the migrant story of the kafala system being definitely much more talked about than before, and that's not just myself and other people who were already opposed to it before who are talking about this, but there is definitely a wider, like, let's say that the tent, like if we talk about the revolution as kind of building a tent, the tent is now much wider. And there's potential there. It's not just like hoping for the best. There is actual potential there, and I do hope that like this is the hope part of people actually continuing to build something that we may not see in the near-term future. We will definitely we might see some successes, like the Ghanaian woman being able to go back home. That is a success. We will be able to see some stuff, hopefully, with the Ethiopian women, who, as you mentioned, are the majority in Lebanon. Hopefully they get something in the near future. It's looking quite bad in Ethiopia right now, but we don't know in the near future, etc., etc. Without rambling on too much, there are certain things on different layers of this problem, because the kafala system, sectarianism, patriarchal oppression, all of those really go back to the same root of the problem in Lebanon. And there are certain, we didn't even have time to go into like the feminist movements that have been popping up in the several months. I mentioned them in other episodes, and we'll mention them in future episodes as well. But it's on multiple fronts, and we're not going to necessarily see all of the positive outputs necessarily in 2020, which has been quite a difficult year globally in any case, COVID-19 including. But we might see them in the short-term future, by which I mean like in the next year or two.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I don't really have anything to add to that. I mean, really, I think that is the silver lining, that just there is just seems to be more room at the table for people, even though that there's it's at this time of immense crisis where there's just less to go around. It's never been clearer, and since the October uprising, how much potential there is in this country. And it's people who are just everywhere in the world, and really many of whom have been extremely successful. I don't know why. I don't buy that it's some inherent genetic thing. Who knows? But people it's never been clearer the amount that we have to sort of rely on in rebuilding this country. And the amount that's here, from the nature to to just the people, the generosity of people, which is sort of inherent in the culture. There's just so much going for this country, and it almost makes it all the harder to see it destroyed in this way. I think that's the sort of the eternal tension many of us feel, this sort of like amazing potential for the country that is just never actualized. But now I think we're in a position where it's almost harder than ever, almost insurmountable. But it's clear that we have people who could be sort of would make up the sort of vibrant new Lebanon that many people want. It's a matter of getting there.
Yeah. That's an excellent note to end on. Thanks a lot for your time. This has been long, but hopefully for people listening, quite productive and interesting. And yeah, we'll speak soon for sure.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure.